Well, welcome to the second annual Southeast Philosophy Congress. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jack Zupko from Emory University. Dr. Zupko has been a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow. He's the author of John Buridan, Portrait of a 14th Century Arts Master, the first ever book-length treatment of the philosopher John Buridan in the English language, which subsequently helped to shape the development of Buridanian scholarship after its publication. That title was also given an Outstanding Choice Academic Title of 2003 award by the American Library Association. In addition, Professor Zupko has edited several volumes, including The Metaphysics and Natural Philosophy of John Buridan, Stoicism, Traditions and Transformations, and he has to his credit numerous journal articles in academic publications. I also have the pleasure of having written my dissertation under Dr. Zupko, so I can attest to his skills as an educator. And that's indeed the slide he takes in John Buridan, Portrait of a 14th Century Arts Master, where he presents John Buridan's thought as central and evolving out of the medieval curriculum. And I'm sure we'll have the pleasure of seeing that attention to pedagogy reflected today in Dr. Zupko's talk, 10 Myths about Medieval Philosophy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zupko.
Gosh, thank you so much, Alex. Thank you, Alex, for that very kind introduction. It's a real honor to be here with you today. And I so much enjoyed the session I attended this morning. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conference. This is great, just talking about things and hearing some really good papers and so on. And I hope my talk today will live up to that. Probably the PowerPoint won't, but I'm just sort of experimenting still with PowerPoint. I didn't know what to put on the first slide, so I put a picture of my dog, okay? And maybe I can make this connection. It is after lunch, and I hope you don't get too sleepy. But that's my dog, Whitby. He's a whippet, and he's having a nap here. And I just like the fact that his tongue's sticking out, right? Okay, so enough about my dog. This talk, I constructed it for this occasion, but it has something of a history. And over the last few years, as I've thought about and taught philosophy from the Middle Ages, I always run across things that people think are true about medieval philosophy, but which are not true at all. And I think that these myths or falsehoods are also quite edifying, and it's a good way actually to talk about what's important in medieval philosophy. So really that's what my talk is about today. I've listed 10 myths. I think I must have been also watching one of those Discovery Channel things, where they have like top 10s, but I haven't ordered the 10. I don't count backwards from 10 and go to 1. These are just sort of in the order that I thought of them, right, and wrote a little bit about them. So with that, I'll begin. I've got, and like I said, I have slides. There are no more of my dog, but I actually had things to put on the other slides. Well, it's most surely a sign of age when one feels inclined to list the most common myths or misconceptions about one's field of study. But since I am in fact getting up there, I thought it would be fun to do, so I decided to give it a try. I was first exposed to medieval philosophy about 30 years ago in a class I took as a college sophomore from the great historian of post-medieval logic, Jennifer Ashworth. Though I had no idea of her reputation then. I just showed up in her class. I ended up taking several more courses from her, including what amounted to one-on-one tutorials and writing an honors thesis on the logic of William of Ockham. Again, it was just one of these things, I kind of got interested in this, and it turned out this was a math and engineering school in Canada, and she didn't really have any students. So, I just started working with her on logic. And then I left the University of Waterloo. Jenny sent me to graduate school at Cornell, where I studied with Norman Kretzmann. And then I discovered that she was actually this really famous person, and they go, wow, you studied with Jenny Ashworth. I had no idea. With Norman Kretzmann, I wrote a dissertation on the philosophical psychology of John Buridan, and I've continued that as sort of my research track since then. I started my teaching career 20 years ago. Eesh. Well, time flies when you're having fun. I first taught at San Diego State University for 6 years, and since 1995 I've been at Emory. So, you know, over this 20 years, such as it is, I've often had to disabuse people of the wrong ideas they have had about medieval philosophy or about the Middle Ages more generally. Where they got these ideas is not always easy to say, but the culprit is often popular culture, especially movies which caricature the Middle Ages as a period of soot and ignorance between the glories of ancient Rome and the sparkling humanist culture of the Renaissance. With a few characters like Robin Hood thrown in for, you know, interest. Robin Hood, who probably did not exist, but is one of these amalgams, right, of different things. Unfortunately, our own histories of philosophy are also to blame, and I think this is quite interesting, because they're tilted towards certain paradigm figures or texts, and to questions that interest us today that were hardly discussed at all by medieval philosophers. And we'll see at least one example of that in my presentation. So here's my top 10 list, actually, again, in no particular order, it's just 10, of myths of medieval philosophy, or lies our philosophical forefathers told us. Okay. Number 1. Medieval philosophers were more interested in preserving the wisdom of ancient thinkers than in advancing their own ideas. Like most myths, this one has an element of truth. It's true that medieval philosophers spent what seems to us an inordinate amount of time thinking and writing about old texts that they viewed as authoritative. Latin term here is auctoritates, right? But their notion of authority needs to be properly understood. These were not texts that they would cite that they thought everyone should agree with no matter what, or authors whose words were cited to shut down all objections and silence further discussion. Rather, authorities were seen as providing a rich source of philosophical questions and problems, as well as the parameters of their solution. Aristotle, who's on the left, is a good example. Aristotle was commonly referred to as the philosopher, so he carries this moniker, right? Everyone knows him. When you mention the philosopher, that's Aristotle. And his works were the foundation of the undergraduate curriculum at medieval universities. But even though his books were studied by undergraduates and commented upon by scholars, everyone who knew them also knew that there were serious difficulties with his thought. Usually they tried to solve these difficulties in Aristotelian terms, but they weren't always successful. And when they weren't, page 2, they would try alternative approaches. Some of these difficulties are well known to us today. For example, the phenomenon of akrasia, or weakness of will, in Aristotle's Ethics, or the problem of self-knowledge in his Psychology. Others are not discussed much anymore, like the incompleteness of his account of modal syllogisms, or his handling of extra-categorical or transcendental concepts, like truth, being, and goodness. I'll only discuss one example here, but I think it illustrates very nicely the attitude that medieval philosophers had towards authority. In Book 7 of his Physics, Aristotle rolls out the theory of antiperistasis, or mutual replacement, to explain projectile motion. According to this theory, the reason a thrown object like a javelin continues to move after it has left the thrower's hand is that the air being pushed in front of the projectile rushes back to fill the void space created by its movement. This rush of air being sufficient to move the javelin along, because like nature abhors a vacuum. Okay? Let me just give you, I don't have a javelin with me, but let this pen suffice as a javelin. Here's antiperistasis. See, the problem is, if you have an inanimate object, it can't be a self-mover, right? It doesn't have a soul. So how is it that it stays in motion if I were to throw it, right, after it leaves my hand, and it were to move through the air? It can't move itself. Aristotle tries out a couple different things, and he finally settles, reluctantly I think, on the idea that, well, as the javelin moves along, it creates a vacuum back here, okay? And at the front, okay, it has to go somewhere, so it pushes this air out of the way. The air rushes back to fill the vacuum at the back of the javelin, and it pushes it along. Okay? That's called mutual replacement, antiperistasis. That's what he says in the physics. Okay. Now this has more than a whiff of implausibility. And Aristotle, I'm sure, is far from happy with it, but that's his solution. So, did medieval thinkers accept it just because Aristotle had said it? Some did, but not for that reason. Roger Bacon and Thomas Aquinas, for example. Here's Bacon and there's Thomas. Both defend the Aristotelian idea that the medium is what imparts movement, because only the medium, the air in this case, is in contact with the projectile, and we can't have action at a distance. Right? See, the problem here is that whatever moves something has to be in contact with it, right? Now, this is no problem as long as, right, the pen javelin is in contact with my hand. But if I let this go, then whatever is keeping it in motion has to be actually touching it, right? Because you can't have action at a distance. So therefore, it must be the air that moves it, or the water, or whatever the medium is that surrounds it. Okay? But others did not, and did not accept Aristotle's solution and tried to find an alternative. One of these was the 14th century Parisian philosopher John Buridan. And okay, so this is sort of embarrassing now because Alex has already plugged my book. Okay, well here it is again, and I put it up there because there's a picture of John Buridan on the cover. You can tell Buridan was dealing with an authority because his opening remarks on the problem understate Aristotle's shortcomings. Here's what he says. The question of projectile motion I judge to be very difficult because Aristotle, as it seems to me, has not solved it well. Okay? And this leads into, his devastating criticisms of the theory. By means of a set of quaint, I think, but very powerful counterexamples based on common sense and ordinary experience. Here's the first one. Mutual replacement might account for the rectilinear or straight, roughly straight motion of an arrow or javelin or pen, right? But it cannot explain the spinning motion of a top, because a spinning top remains in one place and no empty space is created by its movement to cause the required rush of air, right? So think of, instead of a javelin, right, a top that's just spinning in place. That doesn't have a soul, so what's keeping that in motion? Again, there's no movement to create the vacuum that's needed to, explain this motion. Secondly, okay, he's into javelins too. We observe, he says, that a javelin with points on both ends travels just as swiftly as a javelin with only one pointy end. But this shouldn't happen because, Buridan says, the air would easily be divided by the sharpness at the back end of the two-pointed javelin and would therefore be pushed by the air less efficiently. Okay? Here's our javelin. Imagine, okay, the air's rushing back. Now let's sharpen this to a nice point. Okay? And what should happen is that, okay, the air will not... It needs to be a surface here to be pushed against. And if it's pointy, right, the air will fly off in each direction. So what should we see if we throw a javelin with two pointy ends? On Aristotle's theory, it won't move as well. It won't move as quickly, right? Its velocity will be less. And in fact, it's the same, right, as you know, right? So another theory here is required. Finally, why wouldn't a cargo ship that's piled high with grain or straw have its cargo blown forward by the same rush of air that moves the ship, pushing it along? Okay? Think of a ship on the River Seine, let's say. Buridan taught at the University of Paris, right? And it's piled up with all this straw. Well, if there's all this Russian air moving around, why doesn't the cargo blow in every which way, right? It's not. So the theory's got to be wrong. To solve the problem, Buridan famously offers the alternative theory of impetus, or impressed force, a quality imparted to the matter of the projectile by the thrower the strength of which determines its velocity. Historians of science have shown that the theory of impetus was crucial for breaking the hold of the Aristotelian axiom that inanimate objects cannot move themselves, thereby paving the way for Galileo and the modern science of mechanics. Buridan, it must be emphasized, did not anticipate Galileo, but he did remove certain key obstacles, as well as cleverly exploiting some of the consequences of his new theory. Thus, he noted, cosmologists could get rid of the clumsy assumption that celestial bodies are moved by intelligences that somehow inhabit them. And that was a kind of standard approach to the heavens. So when we look at the planets or the stars and we see them move, well, how can they move themselves unless they have souls? So that assumption becomes fairly standard in certainly Neoplatonic cosmology in the Middle Ages. Instead, Buridan thinks that the movements of celestial bodies might be due to gods having given each of them their own impetus at creation, a more parsimonious explanation that better expresses the simplicity of divine agency. So Buridan's solution again is, let's break the paradigm. What happens is that when I throw this, I put a quality into this javelin pen, and that quality causes it to move, and it dissipates, right, as it runs into other forces like the force of gravity. Right? That was not okay on the Aristotelian picture, but Buridan breaks the paradigm and puts a quality of motion in an inanimate object. Okay. You can multiply examples here, but the point is that everyone saw that there were serious problems with what Aristotle had said. So despite the place of Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, Boethius, and many other ancient authors as authorities in medieval philosophy, their authority was hardly absolute. Of course, there were encyclopedists who distilled and arranged the wisdom of ancient authors into textbooks that were studied in school, but these guys were not the philosophers. Philosophers saw ancient authorities as raising serious questions, demanding serious answers, which they were only too happy to give, perhaps especially when their answers diverged from what the ancient authorities themselves had said. Okay. Not all of these debunkings will quite take this long, but 2. Medieval philosophy is basically just rational theology. Or the title, I originally had this and then I threw it out. Medieval philosophy is just rational theology warmed over, right? Something like that. I sometimes call this the equivalence myth. It's also partly true, but the sense in which it's true matters crucially. The classic picture is that medieval philosophy is an amalgam of ancient Greek philosophy and religious doctrine, whether Christian, Islamic, or Jewish. Philosophy was used to rationalize faith insofar as that's possible, but it remained an ancillary or handmaiden science, always at the service of theology and never free to find truth on its own. On the positive side, it's often said that what is good and distinctive about medieval philosophy emerged from their partnership. Thus, Frederick Copleston wrote in his magisterial history of philosophy, published just over 50 years ago, and still widely read today. It's probably in the bookstore here. It's certainly in the bookstore at Emory, right? Students still read this, and our PhD students often look at it to prepare for their comprehensive exams. Claudine? Okay, well, sorry, I didn't mean to kind of pick you out. Yeah, right. Oh, you did, okay. Yeah, so, I mean, it's still kind of an authority. Here's what Copleston says. The great achievement of the 13th century in the intellectual field was the realization of a synthesis of reason and faith, philosophy and theology. Well, Copleston was surely thinking about Thomas Aquinas when he wrote this. And it's true that if your goal in the intellectual field is to synthesize faith and reason, you can't do much better than Thomas. But there were many, many other medieval thinkers who didn't contribute to this project either because they were interested in other questions or because they didn't think it was possible to bring faith and reason together in that way. Enormous quantities of philosophical material were produced in medieval universities by artists, artisti, scholars who worked in the undergraduate faculty of arts and who were forbidden by statute from teaching theology. So automatically they couldn't do theology, which was considered a graduate subject. Okay, so that's the way the medieval university was organized. There were lots of philosophers at work teaching Aristotle and certainly not doing theology. They wouldn't do theology because if they tried it, the theologians would call them on the carpet and say, hey, you're teaching our subject. Right? And this happened. To modern ears, the commentaries that these scholars wrote, the word commentary suggests something derivative and unoriginal. But commentaries came in several forms. Where the master, in addition to literal commentaries, where the master would subdivide the text being studied and give line-by-line explanations of the author's meaning, there were also question commentaries, where the master was free to riff on philosophical problems or questions he took to be raised by the text being studied. Many commentators on Aristotle's De Anima, for example, were prompted by his remark that knowing the accidents or properties of a thing contributes to knowing its essence, to wonder how this is possible if substances and accidents are different kinds of thing. This is a remark right from the very beginning of the text. Right? And the problem is, how can you know the essence of the soul if all you have are the sort of qualities that we observe in living things, right? Their motion, their respiration, their thinking. We never see the soul itself, right? We just assume it's there as the underlying substance of these qualities. The question's clearly epistemological because it raises skeptical doubts about the quality of our inferences in the science of psychology. One influential commentator, Nicola Rem, who's working here, notice the sphere, right? He's a natural philosopher, right? He's not doing theology. He's thinking about the cosmos, and he's thinking also about the human soul. Orem points out that it must be due to a naturally necessary connection between the soul and its accidents that we can determine the conception of its substance. This discussion goes beyond anything in Aristotle, and in some ways it anticipates the interest in knowledge and certainty typical of early modern philosophers such as Descartes. And it was all discussed independently of theology. There are untapped riches in the non-theological genres of medieval philosophy, and by this I mean texts that are unedited, untranslated, and otherwise unknown to the general philosophical public. As these become more available, the equivalence myth will continue to dissolve and be replaced by a much more diverse picture of what medieval philosophy was all about. There's so much work to be done here, and a lot of it involves just work like reading manuscripts that are in libraries. We know a text is there, but I was part of my graduate training was in paleography, or the reading of old manuscripts. In graduate school, I always thought one of my best pickup lines was, "I can read 14th century Latin book hands." Okay, maybe it wasn't so good. Actually, it probably wasn't, now that I think back to it, but that's one of the skills that you have to get at this material, right? Because we're not even talking about stuff that's in editions. It's not just a matter of reading Latin, it's being able to read these handwritten things. Okay? Okay. 3. Medieval philosophy is obscure and overly technical. Okay. Okay, I'm starting to get heated up now. To my mind, this is one of the worst libels of medieval philosophy. But it's hard to expose because technicality, of course, is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. But more often than not, it's a judgment based on ignorance, so let me at least try to expose the ignorance. This kind of judgment is expressed by William James, who should have known better, when he said, "Scholastic philosophy is only common sense grown pedantic." Now, I think we can all understand the concern here. Who wants to be pedantic, if by that we mean being doctrinaire about technical knowledge, or formalism for its own sake, or worse, for the sake of showing off one's knowledge to others? This is the very opposite of philosophical. The question is whether medieval philosophers, or the scholastics as James calls them, are guilty of it. Okay, well, let me just say they are not. But I need first to say that this is a libel with a long history, beginning with the Renaissance humanists, who wanted to move philosophy away from the kind of formal disputation then in vogue in the schools to a new foundation based on authors and texts from classical antiquity, many of which, like Plato's Dialogues, had been newly translated from the Greek. For almost the whole of the Western Middle Ages, the only Plato they had was the first half of the Timaeus, breaking off at about 53 D, because that was the only part of it that was available in Latin, and very few people could read Greek, you know, in the western part of the empire, of the Middle Ages. Okay? So by about the 15th century, you start getting Latin translations, and indeed some vernacular translations of Plato's works. And they had a tremendous impact, of course. Its perpetrators were many, and the attacks on medieval philosophy became much worse after the Reformation, when scholastic disputation, and especially the study of Aristotelian logic, were seen as activities typical of those sympathetic to Rome. Thus, we see Francis Bacon. Okay, well, that's not Francis Bacon. Okay, I don't have a picture of Francis. That's William of Ockham, but I'll get to him in just a moment. Calling his treatise on method the New Organon, which is, of course, a rather unsubtle swipe at the Old Organon of Aristotle, whose author is described as, he's talking about Aristotle here, someone who utterly enslaved his natural philosophy to his logic and made it a matter of disputation and almost useless. Aristotle, in Bacon's estimation, spoils his natural philosophy with his dialectic. Yikes, that is very strong. Okay? He again, just wants to reject what Aristotle says. Well, the first thing to say is that despite surface appearances, medieval logic was never more than an organon. That is, a set of tools that medieval philosophers used to solve philosophical problems. Medieval philosophers, of course, did think about logic, which meant that they pursued logical theory in certain specialized genres designed to test their analytical mettle, if you will. But anyone who reads deeply enough into these genres, such as the tradition of sophismata, where we find analyses of sentences presenting certain logical and semantic conundrums, can see that the point was not to use one's logical toolkit to solve problems in metaphysics, natural philosophy, and so on, not to play with the tools themselves. If you want good solutions, attention to technique is both natural and inevitable. Now, I mean, if you look at some of the sentences that they tried to analyze, right? And well, I thought analyzed very successfully. I mean, one was, here's a sophism, you ate raw meat today, right? And then you'd have to, one side, a student would be asked to defend one side, you know, using logic, and another student would be asked to defend the other side. Now, how would that be true that you ate raw meat today? Well, maybe you had a hamburger, right? Now, was that hamburger always cooked? No, it didn't come cooked. Probably at some point today it was raw. Okay? Now, you can see that this is, you know, solvable, but to solve it logically, you have to get into problems of tense, right? And reference as well. And that's how they deployed these, and so they would discuss those things, and you get very quickly into logical theory, okay, as a means of solving that. As a result, medieval logic is filled with sophisticated argumentation, fine-grained analyses, and genuine innovations that are recognizable even to philosophy students today. But Renaissance humanists hated scholasticism so much that they threw the baby out with the bathwater. That is, in their haste to break with the preceding epoch and return to an earlier one, right, classical antiquity, they forgot to see if there was anything worth keeping from the schoolmen. And this led to some terrible losses for Western philosophy. My favorite example here is the theory of logical consequence, or what it is that makes one proposition follow from another. I won't get into details here, but here's a quick history of the problem. In classical Greek antiquity, it was noticed that Aristotle's system of logic, which is based, of course, on the syllogism, did not work very well as a method of proof, especially in connection with the analysis of propositions containing modal concepts. Just full of holes, right? Syllogisms work as long as the propositions are assertoric and fairly straightforward. So, the Stoics came along and made Aristotelian logic obsolete by devising a new system of propositional logic, which seemed both theoretically prior to the theory of the syllogism and also capable of proving more complex positions. Unfortunately, as you probably know, the key Stoic texts were lost at the end of antiquity. Where lost usually means they weren't copied and preserved, or they were destroyed somehow during the barbarian invasions, or most likely they were in Greek and nobody could read them. You do have that with the loss of learning or knowledge of the Greek language. I can tell you on this side, most of the literature of classical antiquity survives because of scriptoria and other activities that were carried out in monasteries, because ancient texts were written on papyrus. Papyrus is extremely fragile. You know, it'll last, if it lasts a century, it'd be pretty surprising. What had to happen is that these papyri containing ancient texts had to get copied onto parchment. Right? Parchment, of course, it's very expensive.
Shell.
What?
Is it shells?
That would be expensive. Absolutely. It's sheepskin. Okay? Now, parchment is very durable. Right? So if an ancient text if somebody would copy it from papyrus onto parchment, it would survive. Okay? I've been in libraries in Europe and had parchment manuscripts in my hands, right? You know, 700, 800 years later, and they still look great. Okay? But that's what had to happen for the ancient learning to survive. And it's probably why a lot of the Stoic texts did not make it. For one reason or another, they weren't copied. Okay. So, medieval philosophers, where logic was concerned, did their best with Aristotle, whose works survived and were translated into Latin. Logic was done with syllogisms, right, Aristotle's method, until the early 14th century, when cracks began to emerge in the Aristotelian system in the same places where the Stoics found them. That is, in the theories of demonstration and modality. So a new theory, the theory of consequences, was developed by the 14th century logicians, William of Ockham, Walter Burley, I wasn't able to find a picture of him, and John Buridan. Here's another picture of Buridan. It's not such a nice picture, I guess but I think that's a contemporary picture, actually. Certainly this is. This comes from a picture of Ockham that it's on one of the manuscripts of Ockham, and we know it's Ockham because beneath this, whoever drew this has written Frater Occam Iste, right? That's Brother Occam. I've always thought it's one of those cartoons that students make of the lecturer, you know, in their notebook. Not that you do that, you know, but I think that's what this is. Anyway, this has survived, and it's from Occam's time, so perhaps some student scribbled this down. Right? That's a kind of caricature. Okay, these philosophers were called terminists because they thought logic should be based on the properties of terms, which are the subjects and predicates of propositions. The result was a much more powerful system for proving propositions and understanding the nature of truth and validity. But when the study of logic fell out of fashion during the Renaissance, the medieval theory of consequences suffered the same fate as the Stoic theory. It had to be reinvented a second time, for example, by 20th century logicians such as C.I. Lewis, as part of Lewis's effort to refine the concept of implication. So again, this is this process of rediscovery, and this is not the only example, right, where the medievals had something and it was fairly well developed and then it was lost, right, because no one paid attention to it or didn't want to read those texts anymore. The final irony here, of course, is that the Middle Ages was long enough and diverse enough to contain periods intellectual historians have dubbed humanist. I refer, of course, to the revival of learning we now know as the 12th century Renaissance, when poetry and the study of literature thrived. Thankfully, unlike the next Renaissance that occurred 300 years later, this was not at the expense of logic. Okay. Medieval philosophers held mistaken beliefs about the natural world. We might call this the Copernicus Criticism. Yes, it is true that medieval philosophers had many false ideas about the way the world works, foremost among them the notion that the universe is geocentric, that is, with the Earth at its center. They got this idea from Ptolemy and ancient Greek cosmology. But here it needs to be said that this was hardly a case of culpable ignorance. From an evidential point of view, the geocentric and heliocentric models of the universe are tied if one relies on naked eye observations. And medieval philosophers lacked a key scientific instrument, the telescope, which allowed Galileo to break the tie. We might even say that medieval philosophers were justified in believing that the Earth is the center of the universe, although they did not know it, of course, because you can't know what is false. It's kind of, we had a couple of papers on epistemology this morning, so... all right. But it would be a mistake to take any comfort in this, especially if it takes the form, but now we know better. Empirical science requires that we test our assumptions about the way the world works, and that we revise or abandon them should they be disconfirmed. And it's not as if this is happening less over time. The history of science is littered with paradigms and theories that were once dominant, but which we know now to be wrong, from phlogiston and phrenology to vitalism and the independence of space-time. The fact is that we do not know any better than medieval philosophers which of our deeply held scientific beliefs is false, and that's because justification does not entail truth. Some radically empiricist philosophers of science have argued that our epistemic position now is not any better than it was in earlier times, just different. I personally would not want to take it this far, but it does suggest restraint when we evaluate belief systems different than our own. Here again, ignorance is our own worst enemy. According to a popular misconception, people in medieval times believed the Earth is flat. And you had that example in your paper, Jesse. So you might want to change it after I'm finished with this. But hang on. Let me set the record straight by telling you that no one in the Middle Ages believed the Earth is flat. Certainly no educated person, and probably no one else either. The ancient Greeks knew that the Earth is spherical. Eratosthenes of Alexandria had actually calculated its circumference and came surprisingly close to the actual circumference of just over 40,000 kilometers. Christian theologians and the Church Fathers, people like Origen, Athanasius, Augustine, all knew the Earth is spherical. There are numerous allusions in the Bible to the Earth being spherical. But there's another, even more powerful reason. The roundness of the Earth can be seen with the naked eye, right? I spent a lot of time growing up on a farm in the Canadian prairies, and I remember how on certain days you could see the clouds taper off towards the horizon, right? You can see the same thing if you go down to the ocean or the sea, right? You just look over a real... you need something in the sky to sort of provide you with a perspective. But what you see is, yeah, things do taper off. You can see the curvature of the Earth. Of course, if the Earth were flat, the clouds would not meet the horizon, right? Okay, I've got some nods. That's good. The poet Kathleen Norris once described the undulating cirrus clouds in the South Dakota sky as if she were looking up at the ribs of a leviathan. I've always loved that. She understands the prairies. You know, anyway, I had to work that in. That's surely what we mean when we talk about the vault of heaven. Okay? So, where did the myth come from? One of the main sources was the 19th century American writer This is Eratosthenes. Was the 19th century American writer Washington Irving, who's in the middle there, who in his fictional biography, The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, depicted Columbus as trying to convince the Spanish court that if he sailed too far to the west, he would not fall off the edge of the earth, right? In actual fact, the king's advisors knew that the earth was spherical, but they also knew it was very big, okay, which would have made an expedition of the sort Columbus was proposing very expensive, right? That was the problem, not that the earth was flat, okay? They knew very well it was round. Nevertheless, Irving's biography was hugely popular, and a myth was born. Some decades later, the flat earth myth was borrowed by Darwinists who wanted to tar some of their Christian opponents with it. It's always been a myth that's been used to libel one's opponents as ignorant or stupid. Unfortunately, the flat earth myth tends to overshadow some of the really interesting false beliefs that medieval philosophers had about the natural world. William of Conches, who's 12th century, for example, was not alone in arguing that the earth, which he believed to be spherical, had two temperate or habitable zones, one in the northern hemisphere and one in the southern hemisphere, separated by a torrid zone along the equator through which no living thing could pass. Okay? Now you talk about twin Earth. This is like, this meant that there might be human inhabitants in the southern hemisphere, though we could never meet them because crossing the torrid zone would mean certain death. Right? William himself believed that humans lived only in the northern temperate zone. The idea of these climatic zones comes from Stoic and Neoplatonic cosmologists of late antiquity, and it was picked up by the 5th century Roman grammarian Macrobius, who transmitted it to medieval posterity. It's the dominant theory, right, of climate until Aristotle's works on natural philosophy are recovered at the end of the 12th century. Okay? And they replaced Plato's Timaeus as the key textbook in natural science. And this is a depiction that I got off the web, like everything else here, of the different temperate zones. And the key thing to see here is that, here we have two sort of independent existences, and they never meet each other, again, because you can't cross the torrid zone, because you'll burn up, right? And that's what William of Conches actually thought. If you get a chance sometime, take a look at his Dragmaticon, which is a textbook on natural philosophy that was used at the University of Paris at the end of the 12th century. And it is just fascinating to see just some of the weird and wacky things that they believed, and also some of the phenomena that they tried to explain. Right? Quite interesting. Okay. Medieval philosophers were tortured or burnt at the stake if they said the wrong thing. This myth persists because it is part of our own mythology of academic freedom. Scholars and scientists had it tough in centuries past. Think of what Galileo endured for daring to pronounce that the Earth is not the center of the universe. In our own more enlightened age, we have seen fit to give professors tenure because a just society values both the pursuit of truth and the ability of those who find it to pronounce it without fear of reprisal. The only problem with this is that medieval philosophers did not live in fear of being tortured or burnt at the stake if they said the wrong thing. They might have feared being publicly refuted at one of the disputations or formal debates that were held at the universities, but this is surely evidence of the existence of free inquiry, not a strike against it. Occasionally someone, usually a theologian, was investigated on suspicion of heresy. But this was a formal procedure in which the views of the accused were carefully examined by a panel of experts who advised the authorities on the proper course of action. I stress here that it was always the views, not the person, which were investigated. An author could always testify in his defense, providing an apologia or explanation of his views. But there are many cases where the investigation was posthumous, in which case the views were always examined on their own merits. Right? So someone was declared a heretic and is already dead. Well, we investigate by actually looking at the views and seeing what they amount to, and if indeed they do amount to heresy. If any views needed to be condemned, they would be clearly set out in an official document with the reasons for each error fully explained. The author would then be asked, not forced, asked, to recant. There were consequences if he didn't, such as losing his teaching position in the university, which might of course lead to self-imposed exile as he looked for another means of supporting himself. But no one was tortured or threatened with death if he didn't recant. If the error was especially pernicious, such as the attack on Aristotelianism by the Paris theologian Nicholas of Autrecourt in the 1340s, an author might be required to burn his works in public. Nicholas did so and was made dean of Metz Cathedral 3 years later. Not a bad landing for a disgraced academic. Okay. So really, the burning part of it for the Middle Ages is the worst it gets is the books, right? And you have to do this in public, and it's supposed to be part of an act of penance and an act of humiliation, self-humiliation, etc. It would be wrong to say that torture and burning at the stake never happened, but these were exceptional events. Typically, and I think in a way that should resonate with our post-9/11 world, tolerance for disagreement was radically curtailed when the church felt it was under serious threat, a kind of medieval code orange. Heresy was the main culprit here, although uprooting heresy was never just a matter of getting people to change their beliefs. Heretical sects had their own bishops, churches, and material wealth, so much so that they stood as a kind of parallel authority to the Pope. By the late 12th century, the Cathar heresy had infested most of southern France, where it had become part of the local culture, pitting secular rulers and armies against each other. Thousands were tortured and killed in the subsequent Albigensian crusade, during which Pope Gregory IX brought the office of the Inquisition under the control of the papacy itself and entrusted its operations to the Dominicans. Those accused of heresy were given a chance to recant. If they did not, they were usually handed over to civil authorities and either hanged or burned at the stake. Not pleasant, but not uniquely medieval either. I guess I'm going on a limb here. I know of no medieval philosopher who was tortured or killed by civil authorities for his views, although this certainly did happen in the Counter-Reformation, which is often confused with the Middle Ages. Everyone thinks of Giordano Bruno being burned at the stake for his heterodox theological beliefs and his stubborn defense of Copernicanism, but note that this happened in 1600, in the lifetime of Descartes. It is in the Counter-Reformation that we find the first examples of hysteria over witches, though those accused were usually hanged rather than burned, and the use of technology such as the rack. Gee, that sounds so medieval, right? But one problem is it's not in the Middle Ages. The rack to extract confessions from one's religious opponents. I believe the confusion here is partly due to the tendency of certain reformers to lump together everything Catholic as evil, a move that indiscriminately swept up the whole of the Middle Ages with the Renaissance Church as idle and corrupt. We saw above how this tendency resulted in some tragic losses of philosophical learning. All right, moving along here. Medieval philosophy reached its zenith in the thought of Thomas Aquinas. This is a myth that can still be found in some older histories of philosophy. The basic picture is of medieval philosophy climbing a long and difficult road from virtually nothing at the fall of Rome to the brilliant age of scholasticism in the 13th century, where it reached its summit in the theological synthesis of Thomas Aquinas. Thereafter, it went into decline as the church was beset by internal division as well as struggles with secular rulers, and philosophers were afflicted by nominalism and skepticism and their own division into rival schools of thought. And this led to the disaster of modernism and the Reformation. Okay, it's never been the same since. I caricature here, but only slightly. In terms of the historiography of medieval philosophy, its advent corresponds suspiciously to the 1879 publication of Aeterni Patris, the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, which enlists Thomas Aquinas in the cause of restoring Christian philosophy to serve as a bulwark against the deadly influence of modernism. Here is what Pope Leo says about Thomas. It's the first paragraph. Among the scholastic doctors, the chief and master of all towers Thomas Aquinas. I think overall towers Thomas Aquinas, who, as Cajetan observes, because he most venerated the ancient doctors of the Church, in a certain way seems to have inherited the intellect of all. Looks like he can speak for everyone. That's what he's saying, okay? The doctrines of those illustrious men, like the scattered members of a body, Thomas collected together and cemented, distributed in a wonderful order, and so increased with important additions that he has rightly and deservedly esteemed the special bulwark and glory of the Catholic faith. With his spirit at once humble and swift, his memory ready and tenacious, his life spotless throughout, a lover of truth for its own sake, richly endowed with human and divine science, like the sun, he heated the world with the warmth of his virtues and filled it with the splendor of his teaching. The original is in Latin, but it actually probably sounds a bit better in Latin, but it's over the top, but hey, this is to establish a point. There's no doubt that Thomas Aquinas was a brilliant philosopher and that he's most deserving of his place in the pantheon of great Western thinkers. But that's not quite what Pope Leo is doing here. His real purpose is revealed in the next section of the encyclical. That's the second paragraph. Moreover, the angelic doctor pushed his philosophic inquiry into the reasons and principles of things. And he also used this philosophic method in the refutation of error. And as he also used this philosophic method in the refutation of error, he won this title to distinction for himself, that single-handed, you don't really need anyone else, okay, single-handed, he victoriously combated the errors of former times and, here's the charge, supplied invincible arms to put those to rout which might in after times spring up. We can use Thomas even today, right, to, take those modernists to account. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican friar who certainly did his fair share of combating heretics and refuting heretics and combating error. This was especially true in his early career when he took on the Cathars. But he did not do so single-handedly, and it was certainly not all that he did. Pope Leo, however, saw in Thomas just the kind of intellectual ally the Church needed to combat modernism and its associated heresies. Okay, I'm going to give you some heresies now. Liberalism, which threatened the political order. Secularism, which deprived the Church of any real influence in worldly affairs. Individualism, which made faith a matter of conscience rather than obedience to Church teaching and tradition. And later, Darwinism, which stripped humans of their special place in creation and indeed removed God from creation entirely. Catholic intellectual history since Pope Leo has been dominated by the effort to make good on this medieval allegiance. What was the actual authority of Thomas Aquinas during the later Middle Ages? Certainly he was an intellectual figure, but unsurprisingly, his reputation waxed and waned just like any other influential philosopher or theologian. As my former colleague Mark Jordan once put it, Thomas had not been dead 5 years before people began fighting over what he had said. The condemnation of 1277 by the Bishop of Paris defines as erroneous more than a dozen positions that had been defended by Thomas, and Thomas was routinely criticized in the theological writings of members of the rival Franciscan order. The most famous of these was the Correctorium Fratris Thomae, the correction of Brother Thomas, by the Franciscan Walter de la Mare. The condemnation of Thomas's positions was revoked before he was canonized in 1325, but even then, his authority was felt mostly in Dominican churches and religious houses. This is the origin of the Thomist school of philosophy, as opposed to the Neo-Thomist, which arose after Pope Leo. But what needs to be remembered is that during the age of the schoolmen, the Thomist school was not the only school. There were also Scotists, Occamists, Nominalists, Terminists, Albertists. I'm not kidding, there were Albertists, followers of Albert the Great, and others, each with their own idea of how philosophy should be done. Hence the period known as the Wegestreit, or the Battle of the Ways. Schoolmen deliberately took up opposing positions. A standard school exercise was to have a student defend a position in the manner of a Thomist, or a Scotist, or Nominalist, and so on. What we actually see in the later Middle Ages is a crazy quilt of rival ideas and people who passionately defended them. What we do not see is philosophical life being dominated by any particular group or thinker. Okay. This is somewhat related. Medieval philosophy is identical with the thought of the Catholic Church. Following Pope Leo's encyclical elevating Thomas to his preeminent position among doctors of the Church, Catholics became less inclined to see beyond the angelic doctor when they studied philosophy, whereas Protestants were more inclined to see Thomas as the lone spokesman for the sorry epoch of human history between the fall of Rome and the Reformation. Such sectarian motives are less evident today, but we can see some of the fallout in the way the canon of Western philosophy has developed. Just look at any introductory text in philosophy, or dare I say a PhD reading list. Don't listen to this part, Claudine, okay? Thomas Aquinas is the paradigm medieval philosopher, and the paradigm work of medieval philosophy is always his Summa Theologiae. This was a textbook Thomas wrote for Dominican novices, and it's the one that Pope Leo wanted to make the blueprint for Catholic and Christian philosophy. Pope Leo ordered the preparation of the critical edition of Thomas's works, now known as the Leonine edition, and still in progress, which led to a cottage industry of translating, explicating, and anthologizing his writings. For the longest time, the only works of medieval philosophy that existed in English translation were those of Thomas Aquinas. If you wanted to find out about anyone else, you had to read Latin. At the same time, philosophy departments at Catholic universities, and only Catholic universities, became avowedly Thomist, as the study of other scholastic thinkers and works gradually faded away. This foreshortening of our historical horizon has been a fairly recent phenomenon. But it doesn't take much reflection to see that medieval philosophy is as different from modern Catholic thought as the pre-Tridentine Mass is from the post-Vatican II Mass. The situation for non-specialists is much improved today, and there are more sources certainly available than there were even 20 years ago. But we've still, as I was alluding to earlier, just scratched the surface. Okay, Alex, thanks. In terms of works. Okay. Yeah, I'm actually almost to the end of this here. Medieval philosophers were interested in proving the existence of God. This is a misconception I run into among students of philosophy, and that's because of the way medieval philosophy is represented in our textbooks, virtually all of which include Anselm of Canterbury's so-called ontological argument. That's Anselm on the left. And that's actually from a manuscript copy of the beginning of his Monologion, which is not where the ontological argument is found, but nonetheless I thought it would be neat to put that up there. And also the 5 Ways of Thomas Aquinas. The myth is fairly easy to debunk, though. Proofs for the existence of God were actually fairly unusual in medieval philosophy and theology, and even where we do find them, they never occupy center stage. There is good reason for this if you think about it. The existence of God was not controversial since virtually everyone was a theistic believer. Why would you want to demonstrate the existence of someone whose existence is not in question? So what was Anselm's problem? Why is he so exercised about this? Well, the actual role of the ontological argument has been much discussed in the last 50 years. But no one thinks that the proslogion, the text from which the argument was taken, is about proving the existence of things foundationally or in the face of skeptical doubt, like Descartes and so many modern philosophers tried to do. Beginning with Karl Barth, a scholarly consensus has developed around the idea that Anselm was seeking to express his belief rationally. Okay? Like the way an artist might paint a devotional picture, or a musician might write a hymn. His gift was reason, so he's expressing this belief rationally. That certainly would be in keeping with Anselm's adoption of the Augustinian credo, faith-seeking understanding. Plus, the fact that he was writing for his brothers in the monastery at Bec suggests that he was not trying to convince a bunch of atheists. The rest of the work certainly makes good on this aim of working through the divine attributes in terms of necessary reason and articulating this particular, almost a form of worship. Okay, the 5 ways, I think, are also interesting. I mean, if you're familiar with the 5 ways or have taught them, one of the first things students see is how incredibly weak these arguments are, right? Also the fact that each of them ends with a controversial identification step, if you remember. The last step is, and this we call God. Okay. The location of the arguments is right near the beginning of the Summa Theologiae. The way the Summa Theologiae is written, however, is it starts out and it tracks upwards. The most important part is not the first part, which deals with philosophical theology. It's the second part, which deals with moral theology. That's where he wants you to get to. The rest is, in many ways, preparatory for the second part. Okay. Let me, I see I'm getting close to time here. Let me just wind things up. Okay, medieval philosophers are insular and provincial. Okay, they weren't. All right, now, yeah. I can just say very quickly that all right, this is the old canard about the Dark Ages, right? Maybe it's what Hobbes is talking about life being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People lived a hardened subsistence life between Viking raids, when everything would be destroyed and they'd have to start all over again. Well, the truth of this is there were times during the long Middle Ages that when life got pretty grim on the European continent. And one of these times was certainly during the age of the Viking invasions. But it's just not true that intellectual life ceases altogether. During the Viking invasions, we have one of the most interesting philosophers of all in the Middle Ages working. That's this guy, I think. I can't read it up this close. Oh, yeah, that's Origen. This is John Scotus Eriugena. Very weird character, right? Almost like he's come out of a flying saucer, but he can read Greek. He's Irish, right? How did he know Greek? He shows up in the court of the Carolingian court, and he's got this really weird kind of Irish Neoplatonism. The works are quickly condemned, but they're fascinating, right? To read. His Periphyseon, for example. The other thing is, the way scholarly careers worked, people moved around, right? You had universities. These were gathering places of intellectual talent from all kinds of different countries with a common father language, that of Latin, right? And mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans. They're essentially monks without a monastery, and they move around a lot. They teach and preach their way around. So, we have a lot of travel. I mentioned this guy, Ibn Battuta. He's a Muslim traveler of the 14th century. This guy starts out in Morocco, moves across the entire Islamic world, North Africa. He goes down as far as present-day Tanzania. He follows trade routes to India. He may have even reached China. Okay? He writes a chronicle that's hugely popular. And this is Ibn Battuta on his camel. This, I pulled off the web. This is the Ibn Battuta Mall in Dubai. This is the food court. Isn't that cool? They named their mall after Ibn Battuta. All right. Last. Okay, we're at 10 now. Medieval philosophers believed in the existence of unicorns. All right. This one might actually be true, but actually, I really I'm directing this all back on myself now. Unicorns were frequently depicted in this genre called bestiaries, which are, kind of illustrated compendia of animals, right? So they'd be a beautiful picture and then a sort of explanation of what this is. But here, medieval authors were simply following their ancient Greek predecessors, who mentioned unicorns not in their mythologies, but in natural history, right? So probably the ancient Greeks thought that they existed too. It's not difficult to imagine that the ancient Greeks were dealing here with third or fourth hand stories of rhinoceroses. At least that's plausible. But anyway, the mythology develops. Unicorns were rare and magical enough to appear frequently in medieval literature and art, right? Which is the form in which they entered our own cultural imagination. That's from a late medieval tapestry. But look, the stock example of a non-existent animal in medieval logic is not the unicorn, right? It's the chimera. It's the goat stag. Here's a chimera on Notre Dame in Paris, right? Right, the head of a goat, the body of a stag. All right. I had always, I do a lot of history of logic. I'd always assumed this was because medieval logicians thought unicorns really existed, right? So of course they wouldn't talk about them as a non-existent being. They'd talk about chimeras, right? Instead. Now they probably picked up the chimera talk from late antiquity because it's there as well. But it turns out I was the one guilty of anachronism here, right? Unicorns are, as you probably know, are paradigm non-existence in 20th century logic. I believe the source here is Bertrand Russell, who writes in 1919. There's Russell there, okay, just below the chimera. Logic, I should maintain, must no more admit a unicorn than zoology can, for logic is concerned with the real world just as sure as truly as zoology, though with its more abstract and general features. To say that unicorns have an existence in heraldry or in literature or in the imagination is a most pitiful and paltry evasion. This is part of his attack on Meinong, right? And it's an argument really about, the metaphysics of being. So there it is, 10 myths and 10 debunkings. Other historians of philosophy might come up with a different list or debunk them in a different way. But all of us have run into these 10 at some time or other. I suppose if there is a lesson here, it's that as students of philosophy, we need to read our historical texts carefully and reconstruct their arguments with a keen eye to context. We don't have to, of course. We could instead use them as jumping off points for our own musings about the perennial questions of philosophy. My friend Paul Spade calls this the, "Oh, that reminds me," school of the history of philosophy. But we would miss a lot. And some of the things we think we see won't really be there. That bothers me. I think it should bother you too. Thanks. Okay.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if it really pertains to philosophy, but did they ever have any proof that the chimera existed?
No. And the way the example is set up in at least mythology, it's one of these combinations of different animals. So they sort of knew from the very example that it couldn't have existed. Because nothing is both a goat and a stag. It would be like a cat-dog. Except my son pointed out to me once there's actually this cartoon with cat dogs or something. There was, okay. So you could tell just by looking at that the chimera or goat stag is not going to be an existent thing. Whereas the unicorn, well, maybe there is a horse around with one horn. Yeah. Yeah, the cat dog. Do you want to see a picture of my dog again? Okay. Oh, sorry, this is, here we go. Yeah.
Do you now include Boethius as a medieval philosopher? Because you mentioned him at the ancients.
Yeah.
And wasn't he killed?
Yeah.
He might just be one of the...
I don't, actually.
Okay.
And that's somewhat controversial because he's usually included as one of the medievals.
Yeah.
But some facts about his life make me want to class him with Greek and Roman antiquity. One is he could read Greek. And he could see the empire coming down around him, so he embarked on translating a lot of Greek works into Latin. And it's from him that we get a lot of Aristotle's logical works. The other thing, too, about him is that his Christianity is somewhat in doubt. And the reason I say that is because he does write theological treatises and does seem to have a role in trying to sort out the problem of Christology, right? How do we understand who Christ is metaphysically? But when push comes to shove and he's at the very end of his life, he writes this work called The Consolation of Philosophy. He never mentions Christianity in it. Instead, his consoler is Philosophia, right? So again, that makes me think, in the deepest parts of Boethius, he's very much hearkening back to the ancient Greeks. But, there are certainly scholars who would say, oh, he's definitely medieval. Yeah. Yeah, Ron.
Question. Is there one work you recommend on medieval philosophy above others?
You mean a history of medieval philosophy?
That's entirely up to you.
Yeah.
But here's what I would read if you could read one thing.
Yeah. Since I'm really big on primary texts, and I've already plugged my own book twice, I would say one book I often use when I teach the subject is it actually appeared quite a while ago, but it's wonderfully diverse. And that's Philosophy in the Middle Ages, edited by Hyman and Walsh. And there are so many things in there that if you go through that, you do get a good sense of the riches that are involved here. But both Arthur Hyman and James Walsh were very much concerned to combat this kind of stuff when they came out with that. And to produce a sort of very secularized, very intellectualized approach to medieval philosophy where they cover a lot of people. There are a few other anthologies out now that also are very comprehensive. What I look for is I don't want the deck stacked too much in favor of Thomas Aquinas. As much as I love the thought of Thomas Aquinas, when I teach the subject, I really like students to see all of the people that Thomas interacted with, was debating with, right? So that would be my selection. Yeah?
Well, you've mentioned the myth that medieval philosophy was insular and provincial, and you gave some counterexamples to that. What about the importance of Islamic medieval philosophy? Because
Yeah.
there is a great tradition.
Absolutely.
Even Rush, etc.
That was my attempt, when I gestured towards Ibn Battuta, right, if I could do even a better job of replying to that point if I talked about Islamic philosophy, because in periods when, very little sort of higher level learning was going on in the West, the Islamic civilization was thriving, absolutely thriving. And, we have Avicenna and Baghdad in the 10th century, to Averroes in Cordoba in the 12th. And it's a vibrant culture, and people did travel around, and they had these Greek texts, and they translated them into Arabic. So it's certainly true there. I think if people have this myth, they are thinking Western, right? They're thinking about the kind of Hollywood Middle Ages, castles and junk like that. Well, it's not junky, but I don't think it's just the wrong idea, I guess, yeah. Sorry, there was another hand? Yeah.
Why do you think that medieval philosophy isn't given more weight in a lot of academic programs? Is it because of these
Yeah.
statistics?
Probably it's a combination of things. In our own culture, it's the way things get anthologized, you know, and the fact that one of the reasons I came to Emory is because they wanted a medievalist, right? My first job at San Diego State, I was hired to do contemporary metaphysics and epistemology. Medieval was a sideline, right? They were happy to have it, but that's not really what they wanted. That's pretty typical. People I know who work in the field today, they have to pick up some other specialization, right, to market themselves because, you know, again, departments, oh yeah, you got to have someone who does ancient philosophy, right? And of course we need someone who does Descartes, right? But Middle Ages, that's just a bonus. And I think that's a product of the way, the focus that's been given to Thomas Aquinas. Even going back to the Renaissance humanist criticisms of scholasticism. And the other thing is just the distance, the amount of textual work that still has to be done to bring medieval texts to the forefront. I mean, we have all of Aristotle, critical editions and lots of translations and stuff. You know, not all of Thomas Aquinas is translated yet. There's still some scripture commentaries. Well, you're working on one, aren't you, Alex? Yeah. That are still not existent in English translation. So there's a lot of work to be done yet. Hopefully in another generation that'll change. Yes?
What kind of effort is being made to overcome these myths? Because some of these things I've been recently taught. I mean, not here.
Oh, okay. Okay, good.
I've heard these discussions about these myths as being the case.
Yeah. They're very difficult to, you know, if one of these myths, it's like some sort of it's worse than an urban legend, right? At least urban legends sound false, right? Well, these are like urban legends and we don't have anything to correct them with, right? So you know, the flat earth kind of thing and the other things. I guess it's, you know, in a culture that sort of flattens things out and sound bites things and doesn't go for the nuance, you know, all we can do is kind of go to the actual thing and show how wonderful and nuanced it is. But, you know, I don't know. I run into these sorts of misconceptions all the time. And that's, I guess, why I wanted to talk about them today, you know, is maybe do my little part to address them. But you're absolutely right, you know. They're all out there, and there's no real good corrective other than studying the Middle Ages. And then you can realize, hey, wait a minute, you know, it's not quite like that at all. Yes?
Would you agree that culture has a great influence on philosophy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, and, you know, in the last, about 25 years ago, there was a kind of surge of interest in the 14th century in William of Ockham. And I love William of Ockham. Brilliant guy, great logician, right? And it wasn't because of Ockham's logic or because we finished the critical edition of the Summa Logicae, his great logic text. It was because of a book and then a movie called, by Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose, right? About this 14th century guy named William of Baskerville, right? Who, of course, was a thinly disguised William of Ockham. And it's this really interesting fictional account of a 14th century monastery, and there's a murder story built in. But that illustrates the power of culture here, right? I wish I could, you know, be a novelist like that and write some novel. But that's the sort of stuff that grabs people's attention, right? That's why the Washington Irving thing got going and took on a life of its own. The book was hugely popular. many, many reprintings in 19th century America, and people just assumed that, okay, that was what Columbus had to do, is convince his financiers that the Earth is not flat. Yes, Jesse.
On the subject of Earth is not flat, I feel fascinated, but also feel very humbled and embarrassed that I actually invoked a myth.
But it's all over the place.
But yeah, it goes to show that the myths are a serious issue.
Yeah, and some of the epistemologists you were citing this morning mentioned this too, right? Exactly. It's just a standard example of a totally false and boneheaded belief that the medievals had. But
I'm just really curious, other than the financiers trying to discourage Columbus's efforts, by maybe bringing up, you can't do it, that sort of thing. What might you think might be other causes of that myth? Because you said that back in the ancient times, which I didn't even know.
Oh yeah.
What might be some other things besides the Columbus issue that may have caused this myth to come about?
I don't know. I mean, again, what's so stunning about it is that just look, you can see it's not flat, You're refuted by naked eye observation. So you sort of think, okay, what is it, art? No, I don't think so. I found lots and lots of examples of medieval art where when people thought about the Earth, it's round, right? It's a sphere.
It's fascinating. When I was in Alaska years ago, and I was on a fishing boat, and I saw that blue horizon. And still sitting here now in this lecture, I never could explain it, but I think I was viewing the sphereness, or whatever the word might be, of the Earth.
Yeah.
Because I was seeing a set of clouds and then a set of mountains, and I couldn't explain it. No one's ever explained that to me since then.
Yeah.
And that could be the naked eye observation of their experience. But
I've seen 3 suns.
3 suns.
As a kid. Saskatchewan, the province of Saskatchewan gets very cold in the winter. 20, 30 below zero. On a really, really cold morning, you sometimes get ice crystals forming in the clouds that act as mirrors. And so you have the real sun, and then you have it reflected twice. And I've seen this, right? I've seen, which is the real sun? Because they all look, you can't really look closely at them, right? It's the sun. The phenomenon, I believe, is called sundogs. And you can look it up, right? But yeah, your eyes can play tricks on you. But this is something that I think, people should be able to see. Yes?
I guess the reason why I'm so interested or fascinated with philosophy is that we're learning, we're trying to explore, because obviously in those days, what they know and what we know now, they have no idea. So probably in 1,000 years' time, they will discover something that we have no idea now. So
yes.
Basically, the knowledge was limited. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, that gets into this debate about, was their knowledge limited or was it just different, right? And it's a tough question in the philosophy of science. And it will turn on your story about, are we progressing or not, right? I mean, how do you see human history, right? And within the philosophy of science, do you see theories getting better and better or more and more approximately true? Right? So that we're getting better and better, for example, at understanding the microstructure of the universe. If you don't buy that, then you're not a scientific realist. You're a constructivist. But that's okay. So is Bas van Fraassen, right? So you're in very good company. Yes?
I guess one of my biggest questions that you addressed as far as one of this was about the natural philosophy. Because I was always... I'll go ahead and say that our school already told you that we didn't have a medieval philosophy class. So it was ancient, and you learned Aristotle, and then you get to modern, and the idea was conveyed that since Aristotle wrote his work on natural philosophy, that was just kind of the prevalent idea from the time he wrote it throughout the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until the modern era that people actually broke away, like scientists like Francis Bacon, Descartes, and a lot of the early modernists really broke. But so I wanted to ask, like during the Middle Ages, how big of a break from Aristotle was there?
Well, the guy I discussed on projectile motion, that's as close as it got. So there was a widespread awareness that Aristotle on many things was wrong, wrong, wrong. And a great struggle to try and fix it, right, on Aristotelian terms, right? Try and write the treatise Aristotle should have written to address this problem. We have in some cases, new theories that come up, like impetus. What we don't have yet, and I think that this is why it's still called the Middle Ages and not the modern period, is a whole new worldview, right? That's what Copernicus and Galileo usher in, a whole new way of looking at the cosmos that has impetus theory built into it. And Buridan sort of, he sees what's on the horizon, but he doesn't quite move it in that direction. In other words, a theory that completely replaces Aristotelian mechanics. And that takes a long time. And, you know, to think up the right kind of model here. Alternative. Yeah. Yes?
This is kind of piggybacking onto this. In my own experience, I do think it's the ancient medieval question that seems to come up the most for me when I talk about medieval philosophy with my peers and with my colleagues. Sort of unpacking the difference between the medieval time period and their repetition of ancient philosophy. My sense is that this can be expanded not just to ancient philosophers, but to ancient historians, mythological figures, and also to medieval historians, scientists, and stuff like this.
Yeah.
So my sense is that the way that I've usually approached this is that it's a question of originality, that the medieval notion of being the original author of an idea has to be different than the modern notion of being the original author of the idea. So Descartes wanted to sit by his fireplace and say, this is what I can come to. Whereas during the medieval time periods, we have notions of pseudonymous writings. We have people that cite other authors but don't actually cite them, just sort of infer. And there seems to be this openness to authorship.
Right.
The problem with this is when I'm in the classroom and trying to teach medieval works to my students who are interested in only the notion of the original.
Yeah, right.
What does teach me that Aristotle didn't teach me? What does Augustine teach me that Plato didn't teach me? Do you have a sense of this problem or how you approach it?
Yeah. If it's a course where I don't have time to do too much, then I will pull out some innovations and say, look at this, the Middle Ages is worthwhile after all. You know, you should look at it more closely. But in a graduate seminar, for example, what I'll try and do is get students to see how sophisticated a philosophical voice is, and how, say in the case of Thomas Aquinas, while there is the argument here, you can see him invoking and speaking in terms of a whole bunch of other things that are not cited and mentioned in the text, even things like Dominican liturgy, right? Because he's talking to other Dominicans and he's speaking in a way that they understand, but that's lost to modern ears, right? And those layers and nuances are all there in the text, but they require a lot of kind of philosophical and literary training to see. And so that if I have more time, that's what I try to do. And you know, it's when you see what's going on there, it's very impressive.
All right, I think we might have time for one more brief question. But we'll unfortunately have to draw the session to an end.
Yes?
So what's your definition of philosophy?
Yeah. Well, I think ultimately, certainly I'm one of those study of wisdom kind of people, so let me associate with that. But it's a lot. It's really about reflection on the meaning of life. When I teach introductory courses, really that's what all of our questions turn on, right? And I want to get my students to think carefully about that, and at least to entertain the question, right? And if they do that, then they'll be able to become philosophical as an action. And that, I think, is really the way philosophy works. It's not a set of doctrines. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of living. And so if we can do that with our students, we've done our job.